All right, guys, so now it is time to put everything that you've learned together from the very beginning of yesterday all the way until now. So let's just start by looking. We're going to classify or sort and name this thing based on its attributes or characteristics. Now, here's what we're going to start with. We're going to classify this based on its attributes. And so basically we're going to look and we're going to decide where it fits best. So if we're looking at the characteristics of living versus non-living, obviously this is a living thing. So let's kind of dive a little bit deeper. It's a living thing. Is it a plant or is it an animal? Well, obviously, based on its attributes and its characteristics, it is an animal. And so we're going to dive a little bit deeper. We're going to look what type of animal it is. Is it a cat, a mouse, a dog, a giraffe? Hopefully you looked at its attributes and you realize that it is indeed a dog. And I think we can dig a little bit deeper. What type of dog is it? Golden Retriever, Pug, German Shepherd, Dalmatian, Chocolate Lab? And if you know anything about types of dogs based on their attributes, especially that little nose that it has, this is definitely a pug. And so what you need to realize is all of these different descriptions are ways you can classify this particular picture. But the further that we go, the more specific we are being. It is a living thing. More specifically, it's an animal. Even more specifically, it's a dog. And if we want to get the most specific, the type of dog is a pug. So the further you go down, the more specific you are being when you are naming it. Well, we're not going to be classifying dogs. We're going to be classifying quadrilaterals, or those four-sided polygons, based on their attributes. And again, we're going to have lots of different names for the same figure, but the further down we go, the more specific we are being. So let's take a look at this. We know that we are going to be focusing on quadrilaterals. So the first thing we always need to ask ourselves, and just double check, is this a four-sided polygon? Well, you can count the sides. And because it is a four-sided polygon, one of the things we can call this is a quadrilateral. But there is a chance that there can be a more specific name for this quadrilateral. The same way that we came up with a more specific name for the dog, we called it a pug. Maybe there is a more specific name for this quadrilateral. So to figure that out, we have to look at some other attributes of this quadrilateral. The next thing we're always going to look at, and this should be familiar, is we want to pay attention to how many pairs of opposite sides does it have that are parallel. And so there's really only three options: 2, 1, or 0, as we previously learned. If a quadrilateral has two pairs of opposite sides that are parallel, that means both of the opposite pairs are parallel, it is called a parallelogram. So I always think about it, if it's super parallel, then it's a parallelogram. So you're going to see the word parallel in that. If it only has one pair of opposite sides that are parallel, it's not a parallelogram, it would be called a trapezoid. And if it doesn't have any, if the answer is 0 pairs of opposite sides that are parallel, it's neither a parallelogram nor a trapezoid, it's just a quadrilateral. So if we take a look at the shape we have in the corner, and we want to decide, is it 2, 1, or 0? Well, here's our first pair of opposite sides, definitely parallel. And here's our second pair of opposite sides, also parallel. So this figure has two pairs of opposite sides that are parallel, which makes it a parallelogram and not a trapezoid. And so we know that this shape is a quadrilateral because it's a four-sided polygon, but we can also call this shape a parallelogram. Okay, and again, the further down we go, the more specific we're being. Well, what's great is we can get even more specific than this by looking at some more attributes. We're going to also look at the angles and sides of this figure, and we're going to start with the angles. The specific thing we're looking for is, are all of the angles, and there are going to be 4 of them, the same as the number of sides, are all of the angles right angles? And remember, that's that perfect square corner, that 90-degree angle. And if all angles are right angles, then we would call it a rectangle. And one of my former students pointed out, there's a nice little hint here. The R could be for like right, and then you have the word angle in here. So it's a nice way to remember, rectangles have all right angles. And so let's go ahead and take a look. You can definitely see that angle is a right angle, but so are all of them. And so absolutely, this Quadrilateral, which is also a parallelogram, is also a rectangle because it has 4 right angles. Again, the further down we go, the more specific we're being. After you're done looking at the angles, you then need to look at the sides of the shape. And if all sides are congruent, that means the same length, equal in length, then we can give it a name called a rhombus. And so if all sides are equal or all sides are congruent, it's a rhombus. So let's take a look. We have that side and we have this side. We have a long side, a short side, definitely not all 4 the same length. And so it is not considered a rhombus. Now, there is one further place you can go. If a quadrilateral, you can see it's definitely not a rhombus, but if a quadrilateral is both a rectangle and a rhombus, it has both of those characteristics, then it could be going even further down and be called a square. But because that this particular shape is not a rhombus, it cannot be considered a square. So if you take a look at what attributes this particular shape had, it was a quadrilateral, it was a parallelogram, and it was a rectangle. And again, the further down we go, the more specific the name is. So you could tell me all 3 of those names for the shape and you'd be correct. But the most specific, the best name would be the one furthest down, which would be in this case, the rectangle. So I don't like to write all these words out all the time. I like to just do like a little abbreviated chart that looks like this. And this is going to be very, very helpful for you as you're kind of working your way through your thought process. And again, the further down you go in the chart, the more specific the name of that shape is going to be. Okay, and that's going to be key. So again, first thing you're going to think about, is it a 4-sided polygon? If it is, it's a quadrilateral. The next thing you're going to think about is how many pairs of opposite parallel sides. 2 would make it a parallelogram, 1 would make it a trapezoid. 0 means you're still stuck at quadrilateral, it can't go anywhere. The next thing you're going to do is look at the angles to decide if it's a rectangle with all right angles. And then you're going to look at the sides. If they're all the same length, if they're all congruent, it's a rhombus. And if it is both a rectangle and a rhombus, then it's also a square. So let's take a look at a couple more. First thing we're going to think about is a 4-sided polygon. In this case, it is. So we know that it is a quadrilateral. So we can keep going. The next thing we're going to look at is how many pairs of opposite sides does it have that are parallel? 2 would be a parallelogram, 1 would be a trapezoid. If we take a look here, these opposite sides in red, definitely parallel, but these opposite sides in blue, not parallel. So we're only going to have 1 pair of opposite sides that are parallel, which means it's not a parallelogram, it is a trapezoid. And if you take a look at our quadrilateral chart here, there is no further than you can go in the T section there. Trapezoid is it. It's kind of trapped in the trapezoid. And so we're done. There's nothing else we need to look at. So we know that this shape is a quadrilateral. We also know that this shape is a trapezoid. But again, the further down you go in the names, the more specific you're being. So the best name would be trapezoid. Let's take a look at another one. First thing we're going to ask ourselves, is this a 4-sided polygon? The answer is yes, which makes it a quadrilateral. The next thing we're going to look at is how many pairs of opposite sides does it have that are parallel? Again, 2 would make it a parallelogram, 1 would make it a trapezoid. We have definitely yes parallel for these 2 in red, and definitely yes parallel for these 2 in blue, which means it has 2 pairs of opposite sides that are parallel. So it is a quadrilateral that is also a parallelogram. The next thing we're going to do is look at the angles and then the sides. For the angles, we're first going to look, does it have all right angles to be a rectangle? And if you take a look, again, I like that Post-it note as a great tool. When I stick the Post-it note in there, it is not a perfect match. Unfortunately, this is not a right angle. And if they're not all right angles, it cannot be a rectangle. So we're going to put an X over the R there. Now we're going to look at the sides. And we're going to look to see, are all sides equal in length? Well, I don't have a ruler here to show you, but yes, they are all equal in length. You can kind of measure with your fingers a little bit. And so because all sides are congruent or equal, it is going to be a rhombus. Now, unfortunately, it cannot be a square because it has to be both rectangle and rhombus to be a square. So if I go through these, it is a quadrilateral, it is a parallelogram, it is a rhombus. And the further down we go, the more specific, the better the name. So the best name, while it can be called all of them, the best name is rhombus. Let's take a look at this one. Is it a four-sided polygon? It is. It is a quadrilateral. Next thing we're going to do is look, does it have, how many pairs of opposite parallel sides does it have? 2 would make it a parallelogram. 1 would make it a trapezoid. If you take a look here, these are definitely parallel, and so are the ones in yellow, which makes this having 2 pairs of opposite parallel sides. It is a special type of quadrilateral called a parallelogram. The next thing we're going to do is look at the angles and the sides. We're going to look at the angles first, and we're going to see if they are all right angles to be a rectangle. If you take a look, my post-it note is not a perfect match. It is not a perfect right angle, which means this is not a rectangle. And don't forget common sense. You know that's not a rectangle. Look at the shape. Take a step back and just peek at it. That is definitely not a rectangle. It's certainly not a square. You know some of these things already, but we're going through the logistics of it. So once we've decided it's not a rectangle, we now need to look at the sides. And in order for it to be a rhombus with the RH, all 4 sides must be the same length. All 4 sides must be congruent. And if you look, the red side is definitely not the same length as the yellow side. So it is not a rhombus. And again, in order for it to be a square, and you should be able to look at that and say, totally not a square. But in order for it to be a square, it must be both a rectangle and a rhombus. This one is neither, so it's definitely not a square. So if you take a look through our chart, we already decided it is definitely a quadrilateral. We decided it is a parallelogram, and that's it. The further down you go, the more specific the name. The best name for this shape, while it can be called a quadrilateral, the best name is a parallelogram. All right, let's take a look at this one. Is it a 4-sided polygon? Yes, it is. So it is a quadrilateral. It does have 2 pairs of opposite sides that are parallel. You can see 2 that are horizontal, 2 that are vertical, which makes it a parallelogram. Are all 4 angles right angles? If so, it would be a rectangle. And you can see there's 1 perfect fit, 2 perfect fit, 3 perfect fit there in that angle, 4 perfect fit. And so yes, this is a rectangle because it has 4 right angles. The next thing we're going to look at is, does it have all equal sides? Now, sometimes the measurements will be told to you. Like if I told you each side is 2 inches, you can say, oh, well, they're all definitely the same. Here you kind of have to use your best judgment, but yes, they are all the same, equal, congruent sides, which makes it a rhombus. And again, if a shape is a rectangle and a rhombus, then another name for it would be a square. And if you look at that, guys, you know that that is a square. And what's really interesting is something you may have never realized is a square is one of the first shapes you learn when you're little, but you didn't realize that a square is a quadrilateral. A square is a parallelogram. A square is a rectangle, and a square is a rhombus. But the best name, because we get more specific as we go down, the best name for a square is a square. It can be called all those other things, but that's the best name. So now you're going to try some. I recommend you make that same chart. You just draw a Q, you branch off with a P, and you branch off with a T. From the P for parallelogram, you branch off with a 2 as well. One is an R for rectangle, one is an RH for rhombus, and then they come together for S square. So you want to make sure you draw one of those charts that helps trace your thinking as you're going through each problem. And do that on some scrap paper. And you're going to think through those attributes that we talked about. You can always rewatch the video and go through an example again and kind of jot down some notes if you need to. What I want you to do is make sure you're listing all the names for the figure like we were, but circle just the most specific name. Again, the further down you go, the more specific it is. So the furthest you've gone is going to be the one you circle. Once you're done, the next video will go over the answers and let you know if you're on track or not. So you may pause this so that you can see what you're working with. And then this will be a good indication of whether or not you're understanding this concept.